I'm A.V. Powell. I've been doing actuarial consulting for continuing care retirement communities since 1979. We work with about 10% of the industry nationwide, and I believe, last count, we have about 30 clients, CCRCs in Florida. I've been talking with the task force for several months about the issues that have come up regarding refundable entry fees, and they invited me today to talk about how the tool of actuarial science might be helpful in understanding the risks associated not only with offering fully refundable entry fees, but also managing your communities in general. So I have a presentation of several slides. It's not in your handout, it's a new one. I'll make sure that you all get electronic copies of that, where I want to go through, based on our experience, what do we see as the risks associated with refundable entry fees. And by refundable entry fees, I'm referring to those fees that provide a minimum refund at any time during the resident's departure, be it 90%, 95%, 50%, whatever. Then also share with you what our experience has been in working with our clients nationwide. We do over 150 studies each year. What has their experience been in using actuarial science to manage and price their communities and address whether or not that's something that's viable and productive for the industry as a whole? Feel free as I'm going along to interrupt me to ask questions and so forth. We do have a limited amount of time, but again, I can speed up my rate of speech to catch up with you. Let me just begin. You'll see some slides here that have different colors. This just represents from our annual studies what the data is based on. The most recent study, set of annual data was over 150 clients based on fiscal years ending 2012. And our typical database is about 25 years old. All right. Outline, I'm going to go through three sections. The first one will be, can we mitigate refundable entry fee risk? Then next, I will talk about financial issues that face all CCRCs and just sort of summarize. How many folks offer a refundable entry fee in the room right now? And how many of those do you think, for new entrants coming in, say the last 3 to 5 years, more than half of the new entrants have accepted that refundable fee? So just a small number. I remember the first time we developed refundable fee pricing for a community in Florida. I think it was Fleet Landing back in the 80s. And what we have found is that there's been a transition. Back in the early 80s, rarely did a refund go more than 12 months or 24 months. They're all pretty much prorated down to zero. Then over time, there's a shift where folks wanted the option to get some of their funds back via refund. I don't know if it was the residents or their children, but there was certainly a request for more and more of those options. What we have observed in working with CCRCs that offer this is that if this refund provision is priced appropriately, and let me define appropriately, many communities, or most communities, will have a non-refundable fee where it may prorate down over 2 years, 1 year, or 48 months down to zero. And that covers the combination of the entry fee and the monthly fees will cover the lifetime cost expected for that resident. Then they want to offer on top of that a refund provision. So when I say appropriately, actuarially we can determine what is the additional amount of monies you might need to add to that non-refundable contract such that those funds would accumulate to the refund amount on the expected lifetime for the resident. So if the resident is expected to live 10 years, how much do I need to add over and above the non-refundable fee so that at the end of 10 years they'd have enough to pay out this refund? What we've observed is that when communities offer multiple refundable provision contracts in conjunction with a non-refundable contract, if they are priced appropriately or actuarially sound in their differentials, residents tend to choose the entry fee that is the lowest. That very few folks take that fully refundable fee, which is somewhat evidenced by the anecdotal survey where very few people are taking a lot of those refunds, but they still want them and it's worth doing. We find that when communities offer multiple refund contracts, not just solely a refundable contract, and those differentials are not correct, if the differentials favor the resident, in other words, if the refund amount is not appropriately priced, then you'll find a lot of residents take that refund provision, which can be a problem. But the point is, what I'm trying to make is that refundable entry fees get a lot of attention. They have created some problems for communities, but they are currently the minority of entry fee-based contracts at this time. Nevertheless, it's important to look at those realistically and make sure that they are handled appropriately, because they impact your marketing and the long-term viability of this industry. No one wants to hear about another CCRC and financial difficulty, because it's tough enough to sell these contracts as is. And so you want to maintain, at least my perspective, maintain consumer confidence that it will work. Well, what am I trying to say here? Refundable entry fees are not risk-free, as you all probably know. I mean, many of you that have them say, I've got to have the cash to fund those, et cetera. There are three basic ways we've observed CCRCs have funded them. Many of them offer those refunds on a contingent payment basis. We'll pay you contingent upon reoccupancy, and I'm just going to label that pay as you go for now. But basically, instead of, even though the contract may have the right entry fee and monthly fee, and that entry fee covers the cost of that refund, they're not setting aside those dollars. They're waiting for the next person to come in. And that's probably okay if you're offering nothing but refundable fees. I say probably, it's not quite necessarily. But if you're offering a mixture of fees, entry fees, and you're not able to guarantee that that next resident is going to follow up with a fully refundable fee, then you have some problems, because you may have used those refund dollars for something else. Another way you might fund them is what we call actuarial discounted actuarial funding. And what we do as actuaries, we would take into consideration the time value of money and the likelihood of how long someone lived, to make sure we determine, if you offer 100% refund, how much of that entry needs to be set aside such that over time it would accumulate to pay out this refund. Now, actuaries are kind of like bookies in a sense. We're concerned about meeting the average. Some residents will live less than that, and you have to pay out the refund sooner, but that's going to be offset by those residents who live longer, and you have their money for a longer period of time to meet this refund obligation. So the point is, as long as you got the averages right for how long that contract's going to last, then the actuarial funding will work out. It is impacted by the age of the resident as well as your interest earnings rate. So there are other factors you could enter into this actuarial pricing of this refund provision. But most of our clients typically price it by age, but not by gender. Then lastly, and this is something that very few communities do, but something that's going to probably be more focused in the future, it's not something we recommend, is what we call FASB funding, or basically escrow, setting aside the entire amount of that entry fee refund. As you all may know, and a speaker we'll talk to later, when you had contingent refundable contracts, which were initially defined for auditing purposes back in 1990, for some reason the auditors didn't make it clear what their intent was. Then in 2012, I guess that's 32 years later, or 22 years later, they decided to clarify it. And so many folks were amortizing their entry fees on a contingent basis. My apologies for the accountants in the room and so forth. There are certainly actuaries with great personalities, but anyway, the point was, before you could amortize those entry fees over the life of the building. What is happening now, because of the change due to the convergence of international accounting standards, is a two-step process, and I don't want to take away from anything that the accountant's going to say. Initially, they clarified the definition between contingent and refundable contracts, and pretty much that got rid of a lot of contracts that were contingent. They now have to be treated as refundable. Basically, you have to make sure that the same you don't pay any more than the entry fee received for that unit. But ultimately, because of revenue performance issues and consolidation, amortizing entry fees that are refundable will go away, and that's probably within the next couple of years or so. So my point is, I'm drawing an analogy here and calling it gap. Basically, you could escrow that entire entry fee, and that certainly would be one way to fund these refunds, although it may not be desirable from a cash flow viewpoint. Well, the question is, which of these three, or what alternative should you actually use for funding these refunds? Because I think that, and I'm not a marketing expert, when you sell these contracts to residents, I've been told part of the appeal of the refund provision is that you can tell the resident that they're not locked in to staying in your community. If they're unhappy for any reason, they can go and get a substantial portion of entry fee back if they chose that fully refundable entry fee. Does that resonate with anyone? Have your market folks ever said that to residents? I mean, as far as and also they have the option as well. Well, if you want to save money, and one of the reasons we've observed why folks tend not to take the refundable fees if they're priced appropriately is that during times of high economic returns or interest environment, residents will feel, well, okay, if I got to pay another $200,000 on a $200,000 entry to go to $400,000, I might be able to do better on my investment over time than what I'm getting from this community, and so forth. So the point is that most communities, or many communities, do this sort of self-funding, and one question to ask is that in the best public policy? Certainly from a provider viewpoint, you have a risk that if you're not able to make timely refunds for whatever reason, you have the potential of losing confidence in your refund options, and residents may not take that at all, and they may actually lose confidence in the community. As well as you may have a core of refunds that are due, and that becomes a problem in terms of meeting those obligations and have residents somewhat unhappy and creating possibly a potential run on the bank and all. Certainly though, if you do decide to go beyond the pay-as-you-go, as that first example, in actuarially fund, which many of our clients do, one would want to introduce the concept of age-based pricing for the refund. And why is that? Well, as I said, in looking at that refund, what you're trying to figure out is that how long is this contract going to be enforced? So if I'm setting aside $1 to pay out, let's say it's 100% refundable, to pay out that refund at the end of, say, 10 years, I need to make sure that I have the right amount set aside and they're going to live 10 years. However, what you'll observe is that probably your older residents will take your refund option. So if you based your 10-year average contract life on an average entry age of 80, and it turns out your refund folks are coming in at 85, then you've already begun by underpricing that refund provision. So as a general rule, we recommend that age-based refunds should be done, but you don't have to. You can certainly do it on an average entry age and just recognize that you may be at risk if that entry age shifts over time for folks who are selecting that refundable provision. When you do an actuarial funding, one can certainly set aside the liquid reserves to meet that. And the idea is that if your experience follows the assumption, if, of course, then you will have enough dollars in that reserve, and plus the accumulated interest on it, to pay out those refunds when they're due. Now, what does that mean? Let's say you have 50 such refunds. Well, maybe you might, and your life expectancy was 10 years for that. You may pay out some refunds in the first year, second year, et cetera, and that's going to draw down the reserve. But the same token, you should have an equal number of folks living past that 10 year. In fact, the life expectancy corresponds to the point where half the residents have lived and half are going to survive beyond that. So that there is a way to minimize your risk by doing actuarial pricing for these refunds and holding the reserves to meet that. And we'll talk in a minute about, do those reserves have to be liquid? If you wanted to be very risk averse, there are two options one might do. And the first one we've seen about 20 years ago, it really didn't get much traction, and so I'm surprised now why it's not picking up given some of the recent issues with refundable entry fee or type C kind of contracts, any refundable entry fee, probably because they want to use those dollars to go along with the cash flow requirements of financing. But purchasing an insurance policy. I mean, an insurance product is really ideal for what you're offering. In essence, your entry fee in 99 out of 100 CCRCs is some prepayment of future monthly fees. Rarely have I seen a community set up a fee structure where monthly fees covered everything, operating and capital, and be able to charge a substantial entry fee. I just don't think I have not seen a case where the market will bear that with entry is total profit. So there's some need for some portion of entry fee. Well, to offer a refund, if you go out an insurance policy, which is a single premium whole life policy, you could very well let the insurance company cover this and pass off the risk to them. There's a little issue about move-out refunds, et cetera. Now, insurance companies tend to make money. Very rarely do they run into financial difficulties. Try going to an insurance company and getting a single premium whole life policy for an 80-year-old. It's not something they want to do. Now, That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. In fact, this industry, and as Steve was mentioned earlier, has always been at the forefront of doing things that are to the benefit of their residents. From back in the 80s, before managed care was a buzzword in terms of controlling, managing healthcare utilization, assisted living and nursing, this industry was doing it. In fact, Type A contracts, in my opinion, are still the best long-term care policy someone can buy. Try to find something similar in the marketplace now with an insurance company. And the same thing with the personal insurance policy. So it may have limited availability, but that certainly is a risk-free way to do it. And then the last one is just to escrow that entry fee and live on the interest. I'm not suggesting you have to go to the extreme, but those are certainly ways where you can begin to limit this risk. Where I'm headed, though, is that what is the compromise, or what is the position you can get to that's going to maintain confidence in your refund options, yet at the same token not create an undue financial burden to you in terms of pricing, as well as help you meet, if you're doing some sort of bond financing, have debt covenants, make sure those things can still be achieved. Well, I'm an idealist, and I've looked at this for many years. One thing that we weren't asked to do this, so I'm just giving this for what it's worth and so forth. What it seems to me, and also I'm not really a big regulation person, and I hope to build a CCRC sometime soon. In fact, I will move into one. But I think that we're dealing with a more and more sophisticated resident. In fact, I'll be a resident in 5 or 10 years, who understand risk and hopefully understand what they're buying into, so it can make an appropriate decision. I draw the analogy: if I want to invest in an offshore investment in the Caribbean that's going to pay me double my money in 12 months, whose right is it to tell me I can't do that, as long as it's properly disclosed to me? I'll probably lose my money. I mean, I go to Vegas the same way and enjoy myself. But the point is, I think it's about disclosure, so that if the prospective resident knows, here's how this community is handling the refunds, it's up to you to decide as a resident to move in. And if the residents want to have a more risky kind of refund funding policy, then they can choose the more risky options. What I think is appropriate is certainly a level of disclosure to some degree to say that, yes, we have fully refundable entry fee refunds as well as non-refundable ones. We have adopted a policy of funding it that falls in one of these 5 or 6 categories. And they're in order of decreasing risk. The red line is what I think should be done as a minimum, the 4th category, but I'll go through each one individually. What I'm calling GAP, or basically what GAP should be leading to, where you can't amortize entry fees, basically you put aside 100% in liquid funding. That's the most conservative way you can do it. The community is using the interest earnings on this escrow amount, and I don't think that's necessary, but that would give residents the most financial security, because the money's there, the interest on it is going to the community for their operation, et cetera, but there's a pot of money there for their refunds. And that's pretty consistent with what GAP is doing now. Just because GAP is requiring that, I'm not trying to knock GAP and so forth, there's some other issues that I'm not talking about right now about GAP and financial reporting, et cetera, but it doesn't mean it's the right way you should price it. The next category, again, identifying those refund reserves, but they'll be less than what is necessary to fund it actuarially. As a rule of thumb, for an 80-year-old entrant, roughly 80% female, 20% male, 100% refundable entry fee is about double what a non-refundable fee would be. And just as a rule of thumb sort of thing. So the idea would be you might actually escrow somewhat more than what that double is, maybe 75% of refund, et cetera. Again, these are very extreme, very conservative ways to fund that refund. The third measure is to go through and identify the actuarial liability for refunds. So let's say you sold out your facility and had $100 million in entry fees coming in for the first time, just for the sake of example, and they're all fully refundable. What that means is that 50 million, or half of that, would go into that refund reserve. The other 50 million, coupled with monthly fees, would go to cover operations and capital costs and debt service and so forth. So that would be an actuarial funding on a liquid basis. We have very few clients to do that. Alternatively, then the 4th category is that where you quantified what that liability is. And I think that's very important to know what this actuarial liability is and say, well, we're funding some of it with liquid amounts, but the rest actually is in our fixed assets. And let me explain why that's okay for it to be in the fixed assets. Every community provides food, health care, et cetera, and housing and shelter. And that means they're building a facility. Years ago in the 80s, communities used to put a large portion of entry fees into the building, and they ran into some cash flow issues. Then when bond finance became more prevalent, they had to escrow all those entries and could only periodically draw that down, so there's a liquid amount there. But in essence, you are reselling that building every year and converting that fixed asset into cash over time. So that is the inherent nature of that continuing care contract. So there is not a requirement necessarily that the actuarial refund reserve be 100% funded in liquid assets. Over time, it probably will be as your community pays down its debt and those entries just are held in cash, but it doesn't have to be there initially. Our thought was that what kind of reserve should you have at a minimum? Very similar to the concept of actuarial pricing, where you're looking at the difference between monthly fees and future costs. You have certain net liabilities, but they don't all occur next year. They're spread out over the lifetime of the residents. Refunds are not going to all occur due to death or move out next year. They're going to be spread out over several years. So our thought was the expected refund amount over the next 12 months would be an appropriate liquid reserve minimum amount for funding these refunds. That's going to be roughly about 10% of whatever your refund liability is at that time. Now, over time, you can certainly increase that. And the other issue is, well, you already have this Chapter 651 reserve, liquid reserve. And it's sort of like it's 30% or about 100 days cash on hand. I'll talk later, but really, if you're doing an entry fee contract appropriately pricing-wise, you're going to easily exceed that Chapter 651. So what we would recommend is that the liquid reserve requirement would be the greater of Chapter 651 or this 10% of those 12 months entry fees that you'd have, your entry fees that are refundable at any point in time. Let me restate that. Say the idea is that, let's say you have a facility that's full and you have a refund liability that's booked as, say, $20 million. It's a mixture of refundable, non-refundable, et cetera. Then what we're saying is that over a 1 year period, you wouldn't expect more than 10% of those entry fee refunds to be due. So that's $2 million. So you'd have a minimum liquid reserve for refunds of $2 million. And if that's greater than your 651, that's what you'd have to hold as your reserve. If it's less than that, then the 651 would draw down. But the idea is that these are going concerns. You cannot legislate or prevent a run of the bank. If you have low occupancy and it's declining, there's not a whole lot you can do about that. You got to try to fill it up and so forth. But there's no way building up reserves, et cetera, is going to protect you against that. I mean, it's just a fact of life. Now later we'll talk about some of our clients who actually are operating very well at 90% occupancy, which we would not have thought years ago. But the point is, you can't worry about that atomic bomb sort of scenario. So what's the reasonable sort of compromise there in terms of the liquid requirements? And that would give you the leeway that pretty much, without getting into the timing of when you pay the refunds, if you got 12 months funded, then you can pay out all those refunds that come in the next 12 months and build it up over time. And then the fifth category, yes.
So you're saying that with option 4, it would be, your reserve would be equivalent to however many refunds you take in a 12-month period?
It's the refund liability. So when you look at your gap, say, what is the, on that, on your end of your audit, say a 1231, what is the maximum refunds you'd have to pay out right then? And that would cover, like for the non-refundable ones, it may be a percentage of them. For the minimum refunds, would be that minimum amount. And whatever that number is, it would be 10% of that.
So would you base that on your prior year's experience, or would you calculate it based on an actuarial study, or how would you?
Well, the actuarial study would calculate what the overall refund liability may be. It may be $40 million, or $20 million is my example. What I'm saying, how much of that has to be in liquid? Ideally, you want to have all $40 million liquid, and that may happen on times the community ages and you paid off your debt. But while it's matured and there's still the other round, you're gonna have less cash round. So the idea would be, if there's a $20 million liability, it's very unlikely more than 10% of those refunds will be due next year. So you'd hold a refund reserve, a liquid amount of 10% of that, and maintain that in the future and so forth. So it would be the greater of that Chapter 651 of that liquid amount. So that the idea is you could very well pay out these refunds as needed, instead of having residents being delayed and so forth. And clearly, if you had more cash options, that would be great. 5 is all the other situations where you really have less funding than what this minimum standard is. And the idea here is that not to say how you would fund, but just say, here are communities in one of these 5 categories. Then the marketplace can decide, okay, I'm okay with going in this type 5 category. They don't have the minimum reserves for refunds. They haven't quantified their liability refunds. That's okay with me. I'm willing to put my dollars in there. But the same token, ones that have done a better than minimum standard, they would be categorized and could be acknowledged as being in good, sound position. I looked at about 20 clients who we did in Florida in 2012 and just applied that type 4, and how many met that type 4 criteria. Only 10%, only half of them did at this point in time. Obviously, if one went that way, you may have to grandfather folks in, but it's something that actually is doable. And I would say that, I'm going to show you some statistics in a minute as we go through our data. Well, I'll tell you this now. 75% of our clients nationwide are fully actuarially funded. What does that mean? That means that they have reserves consisting of cash, investments, and fixed assets net of debt that are greater than or equal to their future cost of care for residents, minus the monthly fees, plus their refund liabilities. 75%, 3 out of 4 of our clients are already actuarially fully funded. That means that 75% already meet category 4. So it's something that I believe in the real world can be done. Now, mind you, CCRCs, okay, this is my bias. CCRCs that go through the process of trying to evaluate their liabilities and manage their organization based on those liabilities are probably the more financially capable communities nationwide and probably more financially astute. So it doesn't mean that 3 out of 4 of all CCRCs nationwide might meet this criteria, but there's probably a large percentage there. And it does say this can be done in the real world. It's not something that is sort of an impossibility. Well, I'm going to come back at the very end about the refund part, but let me just go through these next slides fairly quickly just to share with you what CCRCs have been able to do using actuarial techniques for their pricing and understanding their liabilities. And the issue really is, it really goes back to this bottom graphic here. Historically, the industry has been focused on a cash flow basis, and cash flow is important. But you'll find that when you collect 30% of your costs up front, if you're doing it properly, you should have a lot of cash around. I mean, you're collecting 30% of your future costs up front. So what we suggest, and what many organizations have accepted, is that you should also be in the liability management business, not just looking at the cash flows, very much like our Social Security system or pension plan should be. It's not about what the next year's payments are, it's about what is my long-term obligations and where we'll be. Just as Steve's slide pointed out, we looked at Medicare, the original projection how it was going to run out of money, that's about liability management. One could have just looked at the cash flows and said, we're in great shape, but if you don't look out into the future, you don't know that there's a problem coming and you don't have a chance to change your policies to avoid those issues. We'll go through like 10 questions very quickly. These are questions that residents often ask. You all may ask as providers, just to share with you how actuarial tools have been used to address that. Ever since I came in this industry, I've been hearing, has anyone else heard this? Type A contracts are a dinosaur. They're going away and so forth. And that's been 35 years now and they're still here. You know, this product is not a mainstream product, but it's a product that a lot of people value. And if you look at the economics, even though you may be serving 2,000 communities nationwide, maybe 600,000 people, that's a very small portion of the over age 70 population. So as that grows, you still have a potential for significant growth and so forth. So the point is, life care is valuable. It has worked for 35 years. You've been in the managed care business. There's a lot of involved in upfront health screening, et cetera. The risk nature and managing that has worked out fairly well. So I see no reason for that to end. Yes, people will live longer in the future, but I'm not aware of any projections where people are living longer but projected to be less healthy. In other words, more time percentage-wise in assisted living and nursing care. And so my point is, as long as that relationship doesn't change, no matter how long someone lives, your type A contract is priced soundly. Now you may have a risk that someone may run out of money if we double the life expectancy because they don't have enough reserves, but even type A helps minimize that type of risk. Type C has a different set of risks that are different from that on the fee for service, but basically all these entry fee contracts do have some risks and they are viable. The key thing I want to say here is that managing liabilities, first by quantifying them and then making decisions to get to where you're funding those liabilities. I've worked with many clients who start out not fully funded, but because they have the numbers or quantify their liabilities, they can get there. In fact, one was in Charlottesville, Virginia, and by design when they opened up, we knew they were going to be 90% funded. They decided to get there over 10 years because they weren't in a state that was forced the regulation to be there right away, and they were able to achieve that. Sometimes, and I'm not knocking regulation, but sometimes having forced financial regulation takes away the flexibility of well-intentioned providers to work out issues and force them to do other things. But so there's a middle ground there. What's the best contract? Well, let me just say briefly, there is no best contract. If I knew what that perfect contract was that every resident would take, I would not be here today. I'd have an island somewhere just sort of away from climate warming or whatever. But basically, the point is, what we recommend clients should do is to price your contract so that you're actuarially indifferent. You know, people make a distinction. I got type A community, I got type B community, type C. The point is, all of these CCRCs offer the same products and therefore have the same expenses. Meals, housing, healthcare, et cetera. That's not changing. Now, the fact that we're not years ago, they used to collect the money all up front. We're not collect all the money up front, or a portion up front and pay the same monthly fee, or a portion up front and pay a monthly fee that change by level of care. That doesn't change your basic contract, your basic services. You're just changing how you're financing and so forth. And some of those financing mechanisms have different kinds of risks. Certainly with the type A, you're more susceptible to higher than expected healthcare utilization. Again, remember, actuaries are bookies, so we're trying to get to that average. With type C, you're worried about someone running out of money and so forth, given all things equal. So there's no perfect contract, and it's really a matter of giving the marketplace an option to decide what makes sense for them. And that's what I'm saying here, that really, it really depends on the individual's assessment of what they're trying to protect their assets, and so whether or not they want a type A, B, or C. How likely is a resident to outlive their financial resources? Well, as I said, we do many studies each year. This is a trend for the last 5 years. The average entry age for females has been around age 80. We're actually going to be doing a bigger study over the last 15 years and show all of our data, but the average age has been 80 as well, but the 75th percentile, we have some communities coming at age 82. That female life expectancy, this is the male entry age is 2 years older. That female life expectancy is about 11.3 years. It's been fairly constant over time. The 75th percentile is really not that much higher, but roughly about 12 years at age 80-year-old. One thing I want to point out about life expectancy, that does not mean that every resident is going to live at age 80, is going to live to 91.3 years. Half of them are going to die before then, half are going to die after that. It's the average of all of those lifetimes. So when it comes to financial planning, particularly in terms of financial screening, you can't just work off of the life expectancy. Males are a little bit less, but in both cases, males and females are living longer than the general population. And by the way, part of the 10% minimum reserve for the refunds came from looking at what the IOU turnover has been over the last few years for our clients. By the way, most of our clients are type A, a few type Bs, and even less type C. Yes, sir?
The move-in is roughly 80 according to your numbers there. Yeah. If they were 70, would you see the difference in the total life lived?
Yes, you would.
In a CCRC?
And you'd have lower turnover as well. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why when you're doing financial projections in terms of population flow, the couple mix has a bearing on how you've configured your facility. The age, there's all sorts of factors here. It's not, and it makes it difficult for one rule of thumb to capture everything that you need to have in terms of your financial management. Has anyone had a resident ask them if they could retire from inflation? They'll say to you, wait a minute, you're not supposed to raise these fees. By the way, our clients, the IOU expenses were up about 4% over last year. The same site means that some of the communities we do the same community each year to year is only up about 1%. Yes, Steve.
I've heard of a couple of CCRCs that are exploring the concept of adding an X amount on their entrance fee and guaranteeing a minimal, like 1% increase for 5 years or 10 years.
Okay.
Kind of pre-front loading and assuming the risk that inflation isn't going to be too high.
Yeah, and CCRCs have been doing that for years. Not to pick on Peter, but I think his facility pioneered back 30 years ago. Knowing there was something that y'all were paying for, you just fixed inflation no more than X amount, Social Security. But you could, them doing it for a limited number of years is worthwhile doing. You could do it lifetime. It's just a risk that the provider is taking. As an actuary, I would say it's probably not a good risk to take, but there's nothing stops you that. And as an actuary, I can say, all right, I'll make some assumptions and tell you how to price that out and so forth. Again, these are things because they're trying to come up with creative marketing nuances to meet a perceived need by a prospective resident. So the main thing is if you do those, make sure that you're doing it on a sound basis. ALU expenses went up 3%, nurse went up 1.8%. The reason I show this from our clients is that CCRCs are not isolated from the real world. So their expenses are going to go up. By and large, the rule is you're going to have to raise your fees to match your internal expenses. So you do want to disconnect from Social Security, the CPI, or the medical CPI, because your expenses may be more or less than that. You may have some mitigating factors, unusual factors, like when the liability insurance issues went up, that caused your expenses to go up more, staff issues, trying to maintain competitive salaries, et cetera. So that it's really important that, no, you cannot retire from inflation. Historically, over the past 5 years, our clients have raised their fees somewhere around 3 to 4%. It's been going down after the economic depression. Entry fees was something that folks haven't always been raising. Has been around 2%, but last year the average increase was basically flat, and that's again in concert with the fact that marketing pressures and people were not moving in, and actually was lower than expected. And that really addresses what you should expect in the future. I've kind of mentioned this briefly. Let me go over the basic concept of actuarial pricing, which you don't have to do. You can certainly do cash flow. Question: if for that 11.3-year life expectancy and for your operating and capital costs over this resident's lifetime, if I tell you on average it's going to cost you $600,000 present value wise, how should you set your monthly fees and entry fees? Let's say you're going to collect it all up front, okay? Would you collect less than $600,000 for your selling this contract? How many would want to collect less? I mean, come on, you're nonprofits. You have an eleemosynary mission here. How many think you should at least collect the $600,000 if that's the number you believe with? And possibly some buffer because you've got a lot of assumptions involved, interest rates, inflation, longevity, et cetera. So basically the concept is, and when I talk with residents, they agree with you, we want to pay our fair share. We realize there are assumptions in doing this calculation, but if the set of assumptions we agree to leads to $600,000 or $400,000 or whatever the number is, then we're okay with you setting fees to equal that amount on average. Now, any one individual may pay less than that, receive more benefits than that, not, but the idea is on average, that's what we're looking at in terms of actuarial pricing and so forth. And in fact, we find that when communities are priced this way, and we call this actuarially equivalent, that people sort of select contracts sort of about the same percentage. When one contract's a better deal than the others, the marketplace tends to choose the contract that's in a better deal. Not everyone does, but over 50% will choose that contract. If you're going to price that way, that's going to lead to certain cash flow implications, et cetera. But pretty much rarely, I think only one time I think the board member was being facetious. No one has said, yes, we got to agree on assumptions. We got to, there's a whole bunch of, but once we agree on those assumptions, if this is what the lifetime costs are, no one says that they believe that we should charge less than what those lifetime costs are. And that's a very important concept to accept. That's what liability management is all about. By the way, when we look at it, entry fees typically are about 30% of those costs. So that's $600,000. The average entry fee is about $180,000. Actually, if memory serves me correctly, it varies by geography, so I wish I had done the Florida communities. But the typical CCRC contract is a $500,000 contract over a resident's lifetime. Person coming in age 8, this is non-refundable. You got to add extra dollars to that when you add in the refund liability. But you're selling contracts that are $500,000 contracts. And so that's the kind of fees that you should be collecting, combination entry and monthly fee, from those residents over their lifetime. One quick thing on point on this slide, I want to get to these others right quickly. If, as we saw, entry fees typically are 30% of the future costs. They're prepaying of those monthly fees by 30%.
Excuse me, said entrance fees are 30%?
Yes, so the slide, when we looked at the, right here, when we look at communities, look at what their entry fee is as in comparison to their total liability is about 30%. If that's the case, with that, let's say I have a community and we have $100 million lifetime cost for 300 residents. Well, if we charge entry fees at 30%, that means that those entry fees are going to be $30 million. And that monthly fees, if this is priced at break even, are going to cover the other $70 million. Everyone's comfortable with that. Okay, and let's assume that and in doing that monthly fee calculation, we assume monthly fees are going to go up to match internal inflation, which in this case I'm using 4%. So what happens to 4% compounded over 17 years? It doubles. So my point is, if you got a community that is at break even right now, where 30% of the liabilities or fund entries are your reserves, which you put in building center, and 70% is covered by monthly fees, then if you go out 17 years or 14 years and everything's been staying in sync, then that $100 million liability now doubles to $200 million. Those monthly fees, those future monthly fees, which was a $70 million present value, now doubles to $140 because you've been matching internal inflation. So now your reserve target is $60 million. It went from 30 to 60, it doubled. My point is that inherent, if you're pricing your community correctly, and everyone said, if these are our costs, that $600,000 lifetime cost, then we should be pricing to do that, you will have reserves that will increase over time because of the impact of inflation and because you're charging dollars up front. Now then, the tricky part, especially dealing with residents. Could you have paid your debt service and provided all the elements of your contract to residents and only accumulated $10 million after 17 years? Yes. $20 million? Yes. Anything over above $0, you still can provide the services to the resident. What the actuarial tool allows you to do is determine what that reserve level should be. So should you decide to change that system altogether or shut it down, you have a fully funded system so it's fair to everyone and you don't have to depend on future residents to make up some sort of shortfall because you're underfunded current residents. Is that making sense to folks? I mean, the idea is that inherent in an entry fee-based contract, you will accumulate a substantial amount of cash. Initially, it may be less while you're paying a debt service, but certainly as you quantify these liabilities, start funding these reserves, that's why we looked at that 10% on the refund reserve. Over time, you should ultimately, if you're pricing soundly, accumulate enough cash to make those reserves liquid over time. And that's a really important concept, and one that sometimes escapes residents initially, but ultimately they catch on. And when I've talked with residents, they all say, we want to pay our own fair share and we like to minimize intergenerational subsidies. Let me wrap up with just a few more quick things. We already talked about this actuarial tool. And I do want to say one thing here. If you don't price knowing what your liabilities are, does it mean that you'll go bankrupt? No, it does not. As I said, you can accumulate less cash. It's this question of you having additional information to justify why your fees are going up when you have $20 million to make. And I'm sure that many of you have been asked, you do your budget's up 5%, let's say, you want to increase fees 3%, and the resident's saying, well, wait a minute, you all have $30 million to make. Why are fees going up? Well, the point is that $30 million is really reserves for the future difference between monthly fees and your costs and so forth. So this actuarial or any kind of liability management tool lets you quantify that difference and make an informed decision. Now then, how have communities that have used actuarial principles done? Just so you know, they have been impacted by the economic recession and occupancy has been going down. In fact, over the last 5 years, our median was 93%. It's down on average about 88%. For clients that are the same ones from last year, from 2012 to 2011, it's been about the same, been a constant amount. Assisted living is about 92%, has been pretty constant time, and nursing care has been about the same, but definitely there's been an impact in independent living occupancy. What's happened is that those communities who have been actuarially priced really have not had a big erosion in their actuarial position. In fact, our median funded status is like 102%, but it's always been over 100% for the past 5 years, even during the economic recession. We have a measure which we call, by the way, and the surplus for new entrant fees, that combination entry fee and monthly fee, has been about 10%. And in fact, our 25th percentile is 2.5 or 4%. Rarely do we find a contract that is not, for new entrants coming in, that is not actuarially priced. So the idea of quantifying your liabilities and pricing accordingly is something that our clients have been able to do in the real world, and I suggest that any CCRC can do and still survive. Just as an aside, we have an ability to look at both the funded status and the new entrant pricing. And when I talk about being in satisfactory actuarial balance, meeting those criteria, we've been actually tracking this since 2004. Anything over 100% is good. It was increasing over time from 110 to 114 in 2007. And you can see it going down slightly after recession. But in the first couple of years of recession, there wasn't that big of a decrease. And I think part is the fact that these communities had sufficient margins to withstand the decline in occupancy, and then they begin to adjust items. But it's certainly a different situation when you're going down from 93% IOU occupancy to 88% IOU occupancy. But none of them have really gone into bankruptcy and so forth. My point is, by quantifying your liabilities, it gives you a cushion that if things are going worse than expected, you don't have the financial crisis that one might have if you didn't quantify those and didn't know where you were. Okay, does financial regulation work? And I don't want to step on anyone's toes here. My point is that it would be nice, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I believe that sound financial management includes liability management and knowing where you are. My experience in dealing with providers across the country, that 99%, well, what's that average slope, 94.9%, or have a high level of integrity, and I'm dealing primarily with nonprofits, and want to do the right thing, so that without regulation, they should be able to get there if they adopt sort of a liability management position. Unfortunately, many are focused on cash flow management, and there are problems that can arise, and particularly with what's happening with the Type C refundable entry fees, so you may have to put legislation in. But you can't legislate full occupancy, and that's really been one of the drivers of the current situation, and hopefully there won't be an overreaction to say, let us change things because occupancy is lower, when in reality, you can't really legislate that. I mean, you know. And also what I find is that most state legislation excludes Type C, CCRCs. Those are the ones that have the financial problems. It gives them an unfair advantage over Type A and Type B, who may very well be doing actuarial or liability-based pricing, because Type C can underprice, not know it, whereas the Type A and B are forced to price appropriately. So if there is any kind of legislation, it should be any type of entry fee product should have some sort of actuarial evaluation of their pricing. And I'm not trying to say actuarial studies should be in the legislation, I'm saying just that concept should be adopted and so forth. Obviously, when you, it's a tough situation being a regulator, because once you designate a community is in trouble, you sort of increase the likelihood that they're going to have a hard time selling contracts. So it's a tough situation to have to figure out what to do and so forth. But anyway, those are just, so my answer is maybe yes, but probably it's tough to do. Lastly, how do you assess the risk? You got to look at your assumptions, but it's an ongoing process, and certainly the liability management. In summary, as I've said too many times, look at your liabilities and set fees to manage those or to cover those. I really think that if you look at entry fee contract regulation, it should apply to all contracts, not just Type A and B. And I think that some sort of disclosure about the funded status of these refund provisions will go a long way. Back in 2010, when they had the bankruptcy in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, they had the GAO report and the Senate hearing on aging. They talked about it, but there's nothing done, and you're repeating history again now. If you keep doing that one or two more times, I suspect, I don't know for sure, it's going to destroy, has the potential to really impair the industry. I suggest to the industry leaders to be proactive and say, we understand their liabilities here, their risk here. Maybe this is a way we begin to mitigate those without waiting for some more draconian kind of legislative measure that probably won't solve the problem anyway. So I mean, my recommendation is to get out in front of this issue, and certainly by looking at maybe a minimum refund reserve, and also in addition to quantifying that reserve so that when a resident moves in, here's where we stand in terms of funding this. Now you can decide, and that should incent providers to begin funding those reserves as they can. Doesn't mean that overnight it has to be funded that way, but certainly for the existing group, kind of a grandfathering, so to speak. And then lastly, in trying to put this all together, certainly it's important for the consumer to be educated, but as you all know, you get a more and more financially savvy consumer. So if you don't begin to recognize these liabilities and fund that way, I think that you may be even more challenged in terms of keeping the place full. That is the end of my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions before your break, or go back over a slide.
Is there any state that's more advanced in terms of, you say you don't like regulation, but is there any state that does some of the things that you suggested, such as, requiring the disclosure of what you do with funding, actuarial planning for refunds?
No, there's not. I mean, no one has really addressed that. There are 7 states that require that you do an ASOP, be in satisfactory actuarial balance. They require an actuarial study. And that would inherently make sure that your refund liabilities are funded, but they're not explicitly measuring what amount would be liquid. The problem when you're in a state where you've got to do an ASOP number 3 requirements, you're also required to be there right away. So if you're underfunded, you're required to adjust fees to be fully funded now. And that's problematic. Actually, as much as I hate to admit it, I shouldn't say it that way, Florida probably has the best kind of regulation, and probably I would think you all could take the lead in terms of stepping up and addressing this refund issue and saying, yes, there should be some liquid amount. I mean, ideally, I would say it should all be, the actuarial liability should be fully funded liquidly. It may be over time, but certainly set a minimum threshold. And before I thought maybe they should be separate from the Chapter 651, I think they can be concurrent, so you do the greater of, but obviously you want to have that grow over time and so forth.
Well, when we did the Florida minimum liquid reserves, it was incremental. I can't remember how many years.
Yeah, I think it's 15 or 10 or something like that, right?
A lot of years.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Al, obviously one of the things that we're facing here is the current interest on the part of the flight crew organization and OIR to time to find that refund. I'm going to speak to the liability we face in that process, particularly with what you can't actuarially identify, and that is the person voluntarily leaves caused by economic or environmental issues that can occur.
Well, the timing, two parts to that question, if I understand it correctly. Even if you put in something to deal with, you got to pay it out a certain amount of time. If you don't have the money to do it, having that requirement doesn't do you any good anyway. It's really more about saying you got to put the dollars aside. Now, there are voluntary refunds. No, you can't predict that, but that's sort of like that run on the bank issue. I mean, there's nothing I don't think you can do legislatively to handle that situation. If your facility, people are unhappy with it, they're moving out in large numbers, that's just a problem. Our experience is that people, even though their kids may move, et cetera, generally speaking, there are small numbers of folks that do that because there's that's where their last move. So, one could be more concerned and say, I mean, usually we use like 1% voluntary move out or 2%. One could be more concerned there, but it's still one assumption, and then your experience could exceed that, so to speak. So I don't think there's really anything you can do with that issue. But I understand the point about the timing, but if you don't have the dollars, even if you have to pay out refunds in 12 months, I think that's even more problematic. I think it's more about setting aside, say we want to quantify these liabilities and we're going to fund at least 10%, so at least we got 1 year coverage and continue to build that up. And hopefully if you have a blip in your move outs, it'll settle down the next year. But if you're going down, declining over time, there's nothing legislative that you can do that. That's just a problem anyway.
Do you think that if we're pushed to settle on some sort of a time-specific period for making refunds, do you think it should be a longer time for the voluntary move-outs? because of what Peter talked about, the extenuating circumstances that could arise?
Okay, well, my experience is that the move out long-term moves are very small, but when I said early on, typically the market spin is that you're not locked in this community. So if you got an extended time, say 18 months or 24 months, fine. But once you start exercising that, I think you pretty much kill your fully refundable contract sales from there forward. Because your residents are your best marketing force, so when they cannot get their refunds, who is going to want to buy those refunds in the future? So it's something that you're almost, even when you have a problem paying out the refunds, you're almost better off paying those off over time. I'm sort of indifferent on the time. What I'm more focused on is saying, regardless of when the time, it should be, let's set aside the dollars to have it there. And in fact, when we do feasibility projections, the projection is that unit is resold right away, so it's assuming that it's paid right away. Granted though, when you have declining occupancy, it's problematic, and also when you're filling up. Those are challenges. So maybe during the fill-up cycle, it may be, until you get to some stabilized occupancy or something like that. But once you're full, any number is just as good as another one, but it's still not solving the basic problem, in my opinion.